This presentation is about revising active and passive voice. First, it's important to identify active and passive voice structures. And the way we can do that is to speak of it in two ways: the thematic role and the syntactic position. Syntax is something you're probably familiar with. When we talk about how the positions of a sentence syntactically, we usually have a subject, a verb, and a direct object. The subject typically is doing the verb, and the direct object is receiving the action in the verb. That's syntax, and it's something you're probably most familiar with. Thematic roles is a bit different. It's more about how the items in the sentence function within the story of the sentence. And I'll get back to that in just a second. So, active and passive voice, thought of thematically, emphasizes three roles: the agent, which is the noun that performs the action described by the verb, typically in the subject position, and the patient, and it's the noun affected by the action of the verb, or the direct object typically. So in active voice, the agent is in the subject position, and the patient, if there is anyone, is in the direct object position. Looking at these examples, the chemist is the agent and the subject, filled is the action and the verb, and patient, which is, remember, affected by that action, is the direct object, the test tubes. The chemist filled the test tubes. Another example, customers are the agents, have written is the action, and the patient, which is affected by that action, is several letters of complaint. We are conducting future research. So it's important to focus on the roles and get less involved with the syntax position. Think about who's doing what and who's being affected by that action. So to make it passive, what you need to do is move the patient into the subject position, whatever's being affected by the action. Then add an appropriate form of the main verb. Then put that main verb in past participle form, which usually is some variation of making it have filled, meaning it adds the ed at the end, or in some non-typical forms like write, it would be written, not just adding an ed. So you change it into its past participle form, which usually requires an auxiliary verb like were or have been. Then you move the agent, which should be doing the action, to a by phrase after that verb. And it can also be omitted. So let's look at the example. The test tubes is the patient because it's being affected by the action. The action stayed the same, but notice how we changed it into a past participle form, were filled. Then we added a by phrase after that, whoever was the agent, in this case the chemist. The test tubes, the patient, were filled, the action, by the chemist. And you can just as easily omit the by phrase, and that's called an agentless passive, meaning we don't know who filled the test tubes, and maybe it's not important. The test tubes were filled, would work just as fine. Several letters of complaint, the patient, have been written, an action in past participle form, by the customers. So it's a by phrase with the agent in it. But you could also omit it. Several letters of complaint have been written. Doesn't matter who did it. Future research is being conducted by us. So it's a matter of switching the position and the focus on the roles. You're going to hear a lot, of course, and have heard before, that active voice is generally preferred, and mostly it's because it's more concise. In the simple count, yes, we saved 2 words when we used the active voice. Also, on a more rhetorical note, it's when you want to focus on the agent or who did the action. These letters of complaint should be answered. Well, when we want to focus on who's going to answer it, we could start with the agent. Our public relations director, Chris Marlowe, should answer these letters. But there are reasons to use passive, and that's when you want to focus rhetorically on the patient, because maybe you want to put emphasis on the patient because it's more important. In the first example from this linguistic study, it says women tend to use more polite linguistic forms than men do. Speakers of low economic status also tend to use such forms in courtroom settings. That's focusing on the agent, but maybe it's more important to focus on the patient. Polite linguistic forms tend to be used by women than by men. Such forms also tend to be used by speakers of low socioeconomic status in courtroom settings. In this case, based off the bolded text, you can see that you're focusing on the patient, which is linguistic forms. Maybe you also want to focus on the patient and the passive voice because you want to put emphasis on it because it's more important. In a research report, for example, I'm currently collecting information about programs. I have asked each manufacturer versus I'm currently collecting information about programs from the 3 manufacturers. Each manufacturer has also been asked to send a trial version. So focusing on the manufacturers, not on who asked them anything. Sometimes you're wanting to just focus on actions or results, so you want to use the passive voice. Each subject was asked. 8 productions were recorded. The productions were transcribed. If you were writing this in active, how do you think it might read? I asked each subject to identify. I recorded. I transcribed, and so forth. But here it's less important that I did it and more on what was done. So passive voice seemed more appropriate. Sometimes you want to use passive voice to make the topic of each paragraph consistent. So compare these two. Which one do you think is more consistent about its topic? When you look at the topic of each sentence, you see that in A, they kind of bump around from topic to topic. Each of the bolded text is different. But when you look at B, you see it's relatively consistent. A drug, it, the drug, with the exception of the one sentence, of course. But what we see is a more consistent topic, and the way that it was done was through passive voice. A drug has been discovered by scientists. It has been shown. The drug is likely to be approved by the healthcare regulator. So it's in passive voice, but what it helped do was make the topic more consistent. Also, you want to ensure that you're consistent about your use of the voice. Always be active or always be passive. Don't jump around from voice to voice as in the inconsistent one. The project will consist. First, we will analyze. Ratios will be compared, so we shifted from active to passive, and the net tax effects of each alternative will be evaluated, and then back again to active, we will design. So go one way or the other and be consistent. As you know, this is also a form of faulty parallelism, so always be active or always be passive, and use some of the points covered in this presentation for choosing. And that's how you revise active and passive voice.